Good morning and good afternoon to some of those on the line as well. And just thank you for joining the four of us today for Safety National sponsored webinar entitled Public Entity Cyber Coverage, Understanding the Exposure and Opportunity. My name is Steve Anderson. I'm Director of Cyber Underwriting for Safety National. I'm based out of Dallas, Texas. With me, I've got three industry veterans that I've worked with over the years, enjoy working with, and bring a lot of good insight to the market. Greg Batista, who's partner at Mullen Coughlin, and he will bring the perspective from breach coach on what occurs when a breach happens, how he interacts with vendors, how he interacts with carriers, how they assist the insureds and their clients in moving them through the process. Michael Picton, who is a managing partner in Endure Cyber. Endure Cyber is a best-in-class incident response vendor, forensics vendor. And Michael will be able to take the vendor perspective on how he works with people like Greg and insureds and instructs them and works them through the process when a breach occurs in some form or fashion. And then finally, we have Ryan Griffin, based in Chicago, with McGill and Partners. And McGill and Partners, he will be coming from the broker perspective on how he instructs his clients in interacting with the carriers, with the insureds, guiding them through the labyrinth of obtaining cyber coverage, and then if in the event there's a breach, how he interacts with people like Greg and Michael. So again, just for all three of you today, thank you so much for joining. We've got a large audience online today. We've got an hour. Just one short housekeeping rule. If anyone on the line has a question, please feel free to use the chat, and we'll try to address it at that time. If we don't address it, we'll have time at the end for Q&A as well. But as the moderator, always like to kind of keep the conversation flowing. If you have a question there and want to interject, please feel free to do that as well. Ryan, I'm going to start off with you. This is an interesting space, public entity. I've been underwriting for, cyber since '08, and this has always been one of the tougher verticals, quite frankly, to put coverage in place for a number of reasons that we'll talk about today. But just if you could maybe give your perspective from the broker side on how the cyber market is for the public entity space right now, kind of what is the current state, if you could.
Yeah, thanks, Steve, and thanks for having me. I think the good news is it's a better state than it was in the previous 2 years. So I always start these discussions by saying, sorry it was such a tumultuous couple years. We'll talk later on some of the root cause of why the insurance market was so difficult to navigate in the years 21 and 22. But I do believe that we're at a point of a stabilizing cyber market for public entities. I think as you look at your own organizations, the investment in needed cybersecurity tools, and frankly, from every sector, right? If we look towards our own federal government, the guidance they've given, and some of the tools and resources they're providing to organizations of all sizes to mature their cybersecurity organization. So I would say we're probably in the best potential state for public entities as we've ever have been. But the one thing that continues to happen is increased scrutiny on that cybersecurity maturity. So I would say that for those that have made the investments and have been able to find the talent to go and implement the tools and procedures that you need, um, it is a much better marketplace for cyber. But we do know that where there are gaps, it does become a challenge to go and procure it. So we'll talk about a little later around some of the key areas we should focus. But I would say in general, it's stable. We'd love to see a little bit more competitiveness in this environment. But we'll kind of talk through what some of the factors at play and some of the things we can do to make it a little bit easier to maintain this insurance going forward.
So in our space, Ryan, there are probably now you'll see numbers where there are 300 plus standalone, markets that you can
Yep.
that you can access. How many of those would you say write public entity business?
Yeah, that is the fundamental challenge. On a primary basis, we're talking, maybe a dozen, maybe 15. And so when you look at where the appetite is for insurers to be your first line of defense in recovering and working with good folks like Greg and Michael on getting you back up and running and navigating those events, it tends to be a pretty small pool of insurers who are willing to write it. And just remember, for context, we won't get kind of too deep into how this insurance marketplace works, but remember that for every insurer that you know the name of, like our friends here at Safety National, there's also reinsurers in the background. And so we'll talk a little bit later about some of the mechanics and what will make a sustainable marketplace. But there's only so much capital out there for this particular primary risk.
Yeah, so maybe kind of a segue into our next question of what kind of limits, retentions are you seeing? I know that's a difficult question because whether you're talking about a school district in Des Moines, Iowa versus the city of Tacoma, or the city of LA, that's obviously, that's a hard question to answer. But what I'm not seeing, I mean, from the carrier side, even the municipalities and larger public entities, I'm still not seeing large towers, and large towers I'm seeing less than 20 million.
Correct.
On entities like that. What kind of solutions are you seeing on your side from a limits and a retention standpoint?
Yeah, baseline, Steve, to your point, we see limits range anywhere from as low as 250 or 500,000 for small entities, and then up to that $25 million range. You're not seeing a purchase of what we would kind of deem catastrophic cover for a lot of organizations. Part of that is the constraints on budget and, frankly, the price that this insurance hit in the previous cycle. But most commonly, we see public entities going between $1 and $3 million in limits, and again, trying to maintain retentions or deductibles that are commensurate with the balance sheet of that organization. So ideally, low five-figure and ideally some four-figure retentions for entities, and then finding creative ways to incentivize all entities to work with our esteemed colleagues on this panel, so that there's not a deterrence to take an event in-house because you think it's your own money. We want to make sure that you're relying on experts that come with these policies. So I think importantly, I think most public entities have realized, even if they can't buy the exact limit of liability they want, part of the insurance process value proposition is really getting access to top tier incident response and legal counsel to help you navigate an event.
Yeah, and I think what I'm seeing, to put a positive spin on it as well, is even getting the application, getting the submission in, having a phone call with the risk manager, whereas 2, 3, 4 years ago, you couldn't even get to that point. So, you know, and those are statistics those are hard to keep track of, but I'm definitely seeing more of that type of flow, either from a pool
Yep.
perspective, or from an individual risk basis as well. Whereas, you know, brokers like yourself are just trying to get the client, our insured, your client, even to go through the process, and that just wasn't happening. And so now that is encouraging to me. There's an uptick in the rate on the submission that we see in this space. And then also, you know, to your point, you know, the binding of that coverage because of the improved controls. So we talked a little bit about, you know, we're in a soft market. Public entity has kind of benefited from that. So have the rate decreases and increases been similar to what you've seen in other verticals as well?
They have. I would say in general there is more competitiveness. It's just a matter of how much interest can you generate on that particular risk to drive down those rates. But Steve, I would say that for this industry sector, it is very commensurate with what's happening across industries. And we'll talk about sort of the macro drivers of what the threat actors are doing and where they're having success and where they're not having success.
So we're gonna, you know, in just a few minutes, Greg's gonna pull up some interesting statistics that Mullen Coughlin has they have from the experience that they have that's very unique. And quite frankly, I've not seen, you know, many of these numbers that tie just to public entity, because typically you'll see the statistics for the larger verticals that have larger uptake rates on the purchasing coverage: healthcare, retail, hospitality, manufacturing. But before I get to Greg, Michael, and Ryan, you know, let's talk a little bit. Ryan, you kind of stuck your toe in the water a little bit on controls, specifically, and obviously is from the underwriting side. You know, I've got an opinion on this, but I kind of want to hear, Ryan, from your perspective, how do you instruct your clients on what they need, what carriers are looking for from a control perspective? And then Michael, if you could maybe just follow up with that with, he's completely wrong, this is what they need to have, or this is what we see in place when something occurs, and this is a must-have, and either validate kind of his commentary, or maybe, you know, maybe you have some other insight outside of what he's saying. So Ryan, I'll start with you. From a control perspective, what are you kind of consulting your clients on, what they need to have?
Yeah, I think it's important always to go to some of the, you know, reputable frameworks that are out there for cybersecurity maturity, and then also what's coming out of the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency. That's a long, you know, there's a big acronym there, DHS, CISA. You can go there and see, especially as we think for public entities that provide critical service to kind of Americans here, they do a really good job of laying out some of the kind of basic hygiene that you should be following. You know, it's like putting my kids to bed, brush your teeth, put on your pajamas. For organizations, we're talking about, you know, access control, looking at remote accesses, especially like I'm in my basement in Chicago today. How do you make sure that you're authenticating the users onto your network? And then we could talk a little deeper about how do you see activity in your network through tools like endpoint detection and response, being able to see what each endpoint, computer, laptop, desktop, whatever it might be, what's happening on that device in real time. So I always kind of start there. Steve, I appreciate all the underwriters asking, you know, deep list of questions, but as an advisor to my clients, I have some skepticism on some of the areas that some of the insurers, not Safety National, but others, the things they want to see and demand. So yeah, there is a very good checklist of basic hygiene that we follow. And then importantly, trying to incentivize those customers to adopt those tools. I think, Michael, you can, we didn't rehearse this beforehand, but I think kind of the backup and resiliency of those uh, those systems is probably the lowest hanging fruit for organizations. Um, so those are a handful of the things that we see to kind of get in the door for cyber insurance. And then again, try to find creative ways to help that get paid for if it's not in place without, more of a carrot than a stick approach.
Yeah, we've
Yeah,
seen
so
that. I think it's good to see from an insurance perspective that the bar is being raised as far as, to get coverage, you need to have some of these things that are now table stakes, whereas 5 years ago, you could go talk to a lot of folks that may not have endpoint detection and response, or MFA was something that was still not fully propagated in the environment. So now, we get pulled in a lot of times on insurance where folks are trying to get renewals and they have to raise the bar. They got 3 months to their renewal, and unless they put certain things in place, they're not going to be able to get covered. We see that a lot on the proactive side, but on the response side, threat actors still find a way to get around all of these things if they're not put in place right. So absolutely, you need to check the box and get the coverage that you need, but you're making those investments. Don't just set and forget. There's the relentless preparation of putting those things in place and making sure that you have the full coverage. There's no exceptions in place, because the threat actors are the first ones to find those exceptions and get around and go in the back door.
yeah, I think as an underwriter, my wife has worked for our local school district for 30 years. She's a biology teacher, now an administrator. So it's interesting to hear her perspective on what they're rolling out. The school district is rather large. It's got 55,000 to 60,000 students. So, it's a large company, right? And what they have to do, what they have to pay for. When I'm underwriting these risks, I typically kind of have to take a step back because I understand, the budget limitations. I mean, that's always a discussion, whether you're public, whether you're private, whether you're nonprofit. That always can be a struggle. We're not necessarily, we being underwriters. When I'm looking at a public entity, the latest, MDR, XDR, EDR solution on all endpoints with, you know, knock the scene that's up to date. I mean, that's just not, that's not possible. But what I am seeing, and I think what's relevant for the discussion today is, what we do look for is strategy. That potentially now with school districts, with municipalities, you can have senior leaders in place where, what's the, for what are they thinking out ahead and what are they rolling out in terms of MFA backups. Training now is such a big part. And this is going to be a nice segue into what Greg's going to show us, right? A business email compromise. Are you training your employees? Because what we're finding from a claims perspective is that, yeah, training isn't a panacea or a fix, but it still helps, educate, regulate, and transfer some of that risk, where insurance companies will be able to insure you. You're taking those steps to mitigate and not just try to transfer the risk completely onto the cyber policy as well. So, my answer to that would be MFA, from an administrator and from a remote perspective. Backups, that can be expensive. What's your strategy there? And then also training is a very big one. Those would be the three, just have to have elements, or even, the consideration. And then all of those other things kind of can fall into place. All those other. management tools.
And Steve, if I could echo one of Michael's points too, you gave that example of, a large school district. I know, Google Workplace has good market penetration in there. You've got Microsoft 365. Part of it is having the expertise in-house or externally to configure and take advantage of the good security that could be built in there, as opposed to the out-of-the-box solution and onboarding folks to an environment that isn't fully toggled correctly, for lack of a better term. So I think we're all getting better at taking advantage of the tools that are there, but it takes expertise to go fit that to your organization. And then importantly, segment, and this is, I think, where we struggle the most is, you scare underwriters at times by not being able to test to 100%, right? And Michael and Greg know this uniquely, like that's an almost impossible task, right? To say, we do this 100% of the time. There's going to be exceptions. I think it's important to define that risk surface and then the other mitigations in place. Because for some public entities, there are systems. I mean, I laugh. I was on one recently where they're still coding in COBOL and they're trying to find coders who know that language. But there's some upside for being on those systems based on kind of security by obsolescence a bit. And to define that, to say this tool does not go onto that environment, but we need this tool to administer and provide a public good to citizens, right? And so I think that's that balance, is identifying that and being proactive in that instead of being scared to say we're not 100%. Hope
Yeah.
that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. Have an answer. Right. We certainly understand that. Leslie, if you would pull up for Greg, I think that's a good, talking about training and business email compromise. I mean, these statistics are fascinating to me. That gives us really a good look into what Greg's firm is seeing. And Greg, again, we appreciate you sharing this. And maybe if you talk a little bit just before you jump into it, where the data, just so everyone is clear, where the data comes from,
Of course.
and then kind of jump into what you guys have seen.
Absolutely. Thanks, Steve. So just to give everyone a sense of where this information comes from, my firm, Mullen Coughlin, is uniquely focused in cybersecurity and data privacy. We're a law firm that helps manage incident response for our clients, often insureds or policyholders of cyber insurance policies. So over the course of time, we've grown significantly, and as you can see by the total numbers, we see between 3,000 and 4,000 incidents on an annual basis. So the statistics that we have, I think, are unique in the sense we probably see the most of these of any law firm in the industry, and we've used that to our advantage to be able to create this this data for this purpose, so that we can track trends. We can give our clients some insight into things like when ransoms are being paid, why they're being paid, what the losses are, what the demands are from a threat actor. And as you'll see in this slide, there was an increase from 2020 to 2021 in overall incidents, and ransomware was the most prevalent incident that we saw at the firm, about 30% of the time. Over the course of 2022, we saw a significant decrease. It actually dropped 36% between 2021 and 2022. And business email compromises, that's unauthorized access to your email environment, it really took the top spot there. A lot of that may be related to the conflict in Russia and Ukraine, and threat actors being diverted to other targets. But unfortunately, over the beginning of this year, and actually probably starting around Thanksgiving of 2022, we saw those ransomware incidents spike up significantly. So it's between the first half, January through June of 2022 compared to 2023, it's up again to about 24%. Hasn't surpassed business email compromises, but there's a number of reasons why that may be the case. We're just seeing a lot more ransomware than we used to. This is an overall picture, so this touches all client types, all industries that we deal with, and really we don't discriminate. We can assist any organization that's having an issue. But we do have data specific to public entities that, if we could flip to the next slide, I wanted to share. So this is a snapshot specific to public entities. This includes school districts, municipalities, any public organization. We've dealt with a number of fairly significant issues over the years. Ransomware has been, top of the list, but email compromises continue to increase over time. Between 2021 and 2022, similarly to the overall statistics, we did see a decrease in ransomware activity on public entities, but that's not going away. They're still targeting municipalities and public entities. I do see a lot of those come in, and a lot of the threats that we're seeing aren't necessarily encryption of data, but rather data theft and risk of publication of that information. And oftentimes, because there's such sensitive data at risk there, that can be more compelling than an encryption issue. I'll show in the next slide what we're looking at from demands and payments. So,
Hey, I'm going to interrupt.
Yeah.
Greg. Go back to the last slide, Leslie, if you would. Because I'm going to get Michael's input on this. Michael, in terms of from the underwriting perspective, this is very interesting to me, because you'll see the incident type kind of flip-flops a little bit. And when you guys go in and do your forensic work, what's missing? What's missing in these clients where you can say, well, their RDP was open, or they didn't protect, they didn't have MFA here, or is there a particular correlation to these incident types that you guys have kind of run across from a control perspective?
Yeah, I mean, you just mentioned two very common ones. RDP being open to the internet, we see that a lot. That's basically an open door, somebody to find an open RDP port and find their way in. For remote connectivity, people getting into VPN where there's no MFA on VPN for remote workers. There's a lot of VPN concentrator vulnerabilities out there that over the past few years, you name it, different types of firewalls and VPN concentrators all have had their issues. So if those things are not kept up to date and enforced with MFA, threat actors will find those and find their way in. The business email compromises, this is probably one where your user training has, probably the most effect in terms of last line of defense, because usually the business email compromise is a means to, to carry out wire fraud or something like that. So, I'll be acting as Greg Batista in Greg's email account, and I'll send a note to the accounts receivable or the accounts payable of one of my suppliers and say that our ACH wire instructions have changed. And it'll look like it's coming from the same person that I always pay for the same service, and I'll take their word for it. And if you don't have a basic human control to do a verbal verification and stuff in place, and you just change that, we see people wire money all the time to a new destination and it's gone. So some of these things are all, and that's where I think you see a lot of this stuff is kind of shifted. But the ransomware, they're getting a lot of there's sort of double extortion, right? There's the lock up your business and kind of tie one arm behind your back and try to sell you the keys to unencrypt your data. And then the second level of extortion is, I have your data. While I was in there, I stole it, and I'm going to release it. And we have seen that trend. I think Greg mentioned that in the last couple of years, we're seeing a lot of folks a lot of the threat actors skip right to the data extortion piece and say, okay, maybe you're able to recover, or you're taking too long. I'm going to go ahead and release your data if you don't pay the ransom. So I think we're seeing that across the board.
The other one you can add in there too, and I'm going to ask Greg and Michael to respond to this, is obviously you could have triple extortion with use of DDoS attacks as well. I don't know if that's as prevalent in this vertical as others. How would you guys comment around that? Is it, or
I haven't seen as much of the triple extortion tactics. Generally, when we see data theft and data exfiltration, that third extortion isn't necessarily trying to take down your websites or take down your public facing systems, because frankly, we've probably already taken them down from the ransomware in the first place. What we're more prone to seeing are outreaches to the the CEO, or not the CEO, but the manager of the particular town, or the
superintendent? Yeah,
superintendent, or whatever the
yeah,
case may be. And
yeah.
we've even seen, unfortunately, situations where they take a little bit more time to research those high level positions within those organizations. And it's not common, but we have seen personal threats made to those individuals and to their family members, which is scary. I don't know how much actual meat is on that bone, how much risk there actually is there, but you get into a situation with that that person, they're not going to want to be responsible for a granddaughter or someone being harmed, because of the situation that they're dealing with. So we've seen that, unfortunately, a handful of times. Not necessarily a trend, but more aggressive threat actors may take that step.
And we see them even call clients or suppliers, or other folks as well. They'll even phone them, reach out in many different ways.
Yeah, family members of school, parents of children in
Yeah,
school districts, they'll hit up.
yeah,
So there's a lot of
yeah.
that type of thing if they have the
Yeah.
contact information.
Social media is the big issue too, because everyone's all over, from the public entity space. That's easy to find names and faces. Ryan, it looked like
Yeah,
you want to jump in. Was there something you wanted to comment on, or am I just
Yeah, no,
misreading?
and I think it's tough too in this industry sector that you're providing usually services to a population you've been elected to serve or appointed to serve. And so there's that balance of like wanting openness and trustworthiness that you're trying to
Yeah,
provide a service, right? And so I think just culturally, that's really hard to put it on full lockdown. You're not working
yeah,
for the NSA in this scenario. You're working for, trying to make a governmental body work for its citizens. And so I think your guard is initially you want to trust people. And I think that just creates some tendency to get exploited, unfortunately, on the threat
yeah,
actor side.
yeah,
yeah. Some of the trickier issues we've had to deal with within these municipalities and towns are when it's the systems involving the first responders, police departments, fire departments, and the sensitivity of the data that they have. Open investigations, targets of investigations, that sort of thing, and trying to manage the notification if necessary, to those individuals, particularly if they may be part of a very sensitive issue, domestic violence, that sort of thing.
All right, let's look at the cost. I think I stopped you from going to the next slide, but this is, I appreciate the comments around that, guys. That was interesting. But yeah, so here's what happens, but here's how much it costs when it happens. Walk us through this, Greg.
Yeah, so this is ransomware specific. So only losses or demands pertaining to encryption or data theft. And if you look at the different columns, you'll see the number of incidents that we've seen on an annual basis has decreased, and that's a positive thing. We've seen the number of incidents pay decrease significantly. If you look at the first half of this year, we haven't had a single public entity need to pay a ransom, which I think is in part due to better underwriting, better risks being placed, because through that process, a public entity learns a little bit in some instances on things that they should implement. So when they come to us, we're happy to see that they have some of those controls and have done some of the cyber hygiene steps that we would have hoped they did 2 or 3 years ago. But a lot of it's being driven by in order to be able to bind this coverage, we need to do X, Y, and Z steps. The ransom payment reason is something that I think is interesting, because we talked about data theft, we talked about encryption. there has been no need to pay for deletion or for decryption key in 2023. But in prior years, the key or the key and delete has been the main driver of payments, and that's really because operations are down. Your school buses can't operate, or the public services are all those first responder systems are down. So that needs to happen very quickly to get them back up. I think we've learned over time, and we've seen over time, better implementation of backups and ways to fail over to systems, because no one's going to be 100% perfect. There's going to be holes. I've seen instances where, someone within an IT department or even a third party says, oh, well, we're trying to upgrade the firewall. We're going to install, something else on our network, and forget to put, that EDR or, MDR solution on that endpoint, or, they leave port, 3389 open, silly things that they probably should be aware of, but they're trying to troubleshoot an issue quickly, and that just leaves them open to exposure. What I think is positive trend, and granted there's only 9 that we're looking at, but the average ransom demand has decreased significantly. I don't know if that's related to anything other than the particular groups that we're seeing being less aggressive, that the ones that are targeting towns and municipalities, or they're just trying to get more incentive for payment because their data theft and their encryption is not providing enough incentive, let's say, for the public entity to make a payment. But positive trend.
And Michael, I'd like to kind of hear your thoughts on this too. But, I remember from, 10 years ago when ransomware kind of started to come in and put this coverage at the forefront, it was the pay or not to pay. And you don't hear that as often. When you're talking about demands, 2021 was 1.8, but let's just say between 2020 and 2023, you're getting a ransom demand of 500,000 to $1 million. You're paying anywhere from, $250,000 to 300,000 potentially. What in this sector, what's the right thing to do? Because, and Ryan, actually, you could probably speak to this. As a broker, clients would say, I'm not paying it, right? As opposed to, I've worked with clients and brokers, even though they have the coverage, they don't want to pay it. Kind of wanted to get your thoughts from the public entity perspective. Michael, how do you direct, your clients in that regard? Does it depend on, sorry, I keep talking, I keep thinking of things. Does it depend on too, like, do they have the right technology in place, meaning backups, the ability to bring that backup, into play? Kind of what goes into play in that decision in your experience, to whether or not to pay the ransom?
Yeah, I think first is just looking at the impact. So if, depending on, if you're talking about like a life critical control system, like a 911 call center or something like that, where getting back online is absolutely imperative, and it's, human life's at stake, and it's, that seems to be the fastest path. And I think paying is probably going to come up, in the priority of the conversation. Whereas, if you have a little bit more time and you have recoverability, you have immutable backups that you can get to. The one thing I'll say about the backups thing, I think we've gotten a lot better in the last few years, but threat actors have also gotten better too. They're people just like us, and they figure out what that a lot of folks have gotten better at recovery from a ransomware standpoint, and they'll go in and destroy, right before they get out of your environment and show you that they're there and encrypt your environment. They will go in and destroy your backups. They will bleach the crime scene, if you will, and wipe out all of the logs that tell you how they got in and what they did, and make it very difficult. So if you don't have that offline copy that you can go to, oftentimes it leaves folks helpless from a recovery standpoint, in which case, you either have to decide to rebuild and take the time that it takes to do that, or pay the unencryption. One of the things that I think in recovery that folks often underestimate too is, you think, okay, I'm going to pay for the key. I get the key and I just, plug it in and turn it and I'm back online. And that's the wrong, wrong thought there. It usually takes quite a while to encrypt data. The threat actors tend to invest a lot more money on getting into your environment and being able to put you in the situation that you're in. They don't invest as much money in the decryptors. So oftentimes those decryptors do not work exactly like they should. They're not perfect, and they may not decrypt everything like they should. And if they do, it does take quite a while because you have to run through. It's a lot of processing to decrypt large amounts of data, and it takes usually a lot longer than anticipated.
Yeah. Yeah, that wasn't a very good sell job there, Michael, but I appreciate the comments, right? I mean, that they, that's one reason they buy the insurance, right, too, so they can hire people like you to do the work that's hard, even though you get the key, to your point. I mean, I'm being kind of silly, obviously, but, you still have to have the expertise to bring that data back. The insurance policy will help pay for that. And pay for your expertise to get them back online. So, Ryan, did you want to jump in on that one at all?
Yeah, the only other thing I would say is I always defer clients to counsel, right? That's, I think, first and foremost, we want to make sure that if you're going to wire cryptocurrency to a party, that they're not in violation or on sanction list, that sort of thing. I mean, that's, I think, first. Yeah, but I also think it is just that calling on experts so you can make as best an informed decision as you can, right? What is the probability we're back up and running? What is the time that that's going to take? What is the cost and the manpower? But then again, running all that through counsel, because you need these. I mean, this is the typical room of this, and the key stakeholders at that client are making a judgment call at the end of the day. And having as much good facts on the threat actors' capabilities, what they've taken down, what can get back up and running. That's everyone, as Greg and Mike can. Everyone is different, but I love to see these stats here in 2023.
It's really a trick question on my part, because the answer is it matters. It's not yes or no. It depends, right? So I appreciate you guys kind of participating in that exercise, because I agree with y'all 100%. I mean, it kind of depends. So Greg, I didn't give you a chance to respond, but we've got a couple other slides here with data that, again, I think is very unique. So I want to give time to get through that. So why don't we go to the next slide, Leslie?
So these stats are specific to our email compromise. We refer to them as business email compromise, but this is really a threat actor gaining access to your email environment. It could be one account, it could be multiple accounts, and that could also impact other online resources. Let's say if you're in Office 365 or Microsoft 365, that could give access to the file share systems. It could give access to other areas where sensitive data is stored. But the trend that we're seeing with email is it's maintained its frequency, and in fact it's probably increasing. I think a lot of that is due to the ease in which a threat actor can now deploy phishing emails, because that's generally how they get into email environments. You'll see something that has an attachment that'll link you to a login screen asking for credentials. It may take you to a legitimate site. It may take you to dead air, but from there they're very quick and able to be able to get into the email environment. And at that point, you may have no visibility of it because they're accessing it remotely from the cloud. I think the increase that we're seeing is likely due to better resources to assist with social engineering, better translation, the advent of AI. Though I can't necessarily attribute it to any particular AI tool, things are easier to fake these days, as I'm sure you're all aware. But the consequence of that is fraudulent wires. I think Michael or Ryan had mentioned, paying vendors and trying to redirect ACH payments. That stuff's not going to go away. So really, from my perspective, the more controls you have around those types of changes, the better off you are. If you're not verifying directly with a known individual on the other side of a transaction with a phone call, or some other predetermined way of verification, you run the risk that it'll be months before you realize that payments haven't gone to the right place. That vendor reaches out, and now you're not only dealing with a compromise of potentially sensitive information in the email account and in these other resources, but also a financial loss, and whose responsibility is it? So
Yeah, I'm just on that, while we're on that note, I'm gonna step in and play the role of Ryan, because I know, and then I'm gonna kind of throw it back to him, but in that regards, I've looked at risks before where they don't have those controls in place. They're not doing callbacks, validating, confirming. So what I've typically done in that case is, I can add language to the policy that, if they don't perform that callback, then that claim would be excluded. Now, that's a win-win because you place the coverage. It also maybe potentially forces the insured to put a process in place that they don't have. And then it protects us as the carrier, because they don't have that process in place, but we want to support the insured and we want to support the broker. Ryan, have you seen those types of solutions with other carriers as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, again, that's more, I would put that more in the stick category, Steve, in terms of, saying you must comply with these conditions. But to Greg's point, with technology comes more sophisticated schemes on verification as well. So
Yeah.
I think you might be able to pick up a phone number and then get a voice that you think is who they are, but they're not. And so I think this is going to evolve. And again, these types of numbers, I think, they add up for insurance companies, but to some extent, some level of coverage to be made whole, and then working with law enforcement and others to try to claw back, as like the quicker you discover it, the better your chances of recouping that money through the banking system is usually my experience.
Michael, any comments on this slide before we go to the next one? Haven't given you a chance to speak to this one.
No, I business email compromise is definitely not going away, and we continue to see it, and it's usually your accounts receivable, accounts payable team. We'll see threat actors get in and run searches to try to figure out who those folks are. So they'll look for keywords like invoice and different things that are associated with payments, and get right to it.
And much easier to write emails that look like they came from me. I mean, all you got to do is scan you're in my email box. You see how I sign off every email, how I start every email. It's not hard to recreate my tone of communication.
And another thing to point out here, oftentimes we will get called into incidents where clients will know that they had sent a wire to the wrong place, but oftentimes it's not their business, it's not their email that's compromised, it's one of their suppliers or vendors. So this comes back to the, make sure you've got a process in place, and that the end users have that training and awareness, because your email system may be secure, but one of your suppliers or vendors or whatever that you work with, they could be compromised. You think you get an email from the same person you're always sending payment to, and you get tricked that way.
Next slide, Leslie. What do we have? 2 left, Craig, or is this?
I think that should be the last statistical slide. So
Okay. Well, that was, no, again, I appreciate you and the firm sharing that, because that's real data. That's not what we think. I mean, that is what you guys have experienced as well. Talk about, we've got 10 minutes here. A couple topics I want to touch on. Talk best practices. With this group, definitely want to have and hear some commentary around pre and post incident. So, Greg, as a breach coach, you get a phone call, you have to go in and kind of surgically look at, what has occurred, what needs to be done. I always say you're kind of the general contractor who needs to be called. So I'd like to hear from your perspective for the audience, what processes are in place when you make that initial call to public entities that you're like, this saved them time, this saved them money. Specifically, what are those items? And then Michael, on the back end, when you get the phone call from Greg to go in, if you could kind of address that as well, because what I'm trying to do is really correlate to the audience, like, look, when and if this happens, we understand as the carrier, you can't have everything in place, but what are the foundational pillars you need to have? So when you talk, to Greg, to Michael, that you won't lose your data, you'll get online. What are some of those things that save time and money, Greg?
Really, it's as much planning and preparation as you can do in advance, and that comes in the form of incident response planning. But that takes on a whole number of areas as well. So, we want to designate your team, the folks that are going to be empowered to guide the organization through the event and are empowered to make decisions on what steps need to be taken to bring the organization back up and running online or deal with whatever the issues are. Those incident response plans are invaluable in situations when we get involved and there's been no incident response planning or no internal conversation. We've seen instances where there's infighting amongst the key stakeholders within a town or municipality, and in certain instances it's been sensitive because of elections and that sort of thing, and people wanting to play the appropriate role but not overstep or put themselves in a position where they could be criticized, even though they're just trying to do the best thing they can for the organization. So it's that, and then also understanding what data you have, because we need to know as quickly as possible what information is at risk and where it is in the system. So when Michael comes in and does his job to tell us what may have been touched or taken, we can advise them from a legal standpoint. I'll step back and let Michael speak.
Well, before Michael speaks, and test that plan, right? I think, again, from an underwriting standpoint, we have a plan in place, we're good. Well, when did you last test it? When did you run it? Because, when I've run through those scenarios, the result of what's on paper and what actually occurs, is very different. So that would be kind of the one caveat I would add to that. And please, Michael, your comments as well. So Greg gives you a call and, you see dollar signs. What's going on?
I've been in very few incidents where they actually pull out the incident response plan and started following it. I was in one earlier this spring where they had just gone through a crisis management tabletop with the executive team. Is extremely valuable that they had just gone through that scenario. It was just a couple hours with the executive team, but they walked through like what would happen if, and it actually stimulated a lot of things that for 1 month later when the incident occurred that it helped. Some of the really basic things in incident planning, like the three folks that we have here, insurance, legal, and response folks like myself, those are really the three legs of the stool when you have an incident. And you can plan ahead. There's some basic things just as far as getting those folks engaged. The critical minutes of you recognize that you have an incident and getting those folks engaged. I've seen a lot of critical time lost and not having knowing exactly who to call when and getting them involved, or where you get tied up in contracting and other things like that. Those are all things that you can easily take care of in peacetime when you're planning to say, all right, I know that I'm going to need outside counsel, breach coach, if I have an incident. Who is that? Line up those folks in advance, know who they are, make sure that they're pre-approved with your carrier, or you've got those written into your policies, and you know who to call, because that alone, a lot of times, we'll see cases where, whether it's in the commercial space or in public entities, they have their normal outside counsel, but just normal outside counsel and specialized cybersecurity breach coaches are it's a very specialized space. You don't want to mess around with like non-breach coach legal counsel. You'll waste a lot of time there. Folks like Mullen know the urgency of the situation and can move some of these things very quickly. And I think starting out with the legal piece is knowing how to orchestrate, then bringing in all those other folks. I guess the fourth leg of the stool, if there is one, I think that's often brought in probably after things get going is the PR crisis communications side of things. So depending on what the risk is for any public entity is knowing, if you do have somebody who that might be, because that's another thing that oftentimes by the time you bring them in, it's too late. You wish you would have had them longer if there's a lot of public relations things that need to happen. But those are all things, if you can have lined up in advance, you can save critical hours and days, just in getting things going.
Yeah, and Ryan, I obviously want you to step in on this conversation too, because you need to advise, your clients. And I think Greg and Michael have kind of hinted, and I'll be a little more direct. You really need to, whether it's a firm that runs a tabletop exercise or puts those processes in place or is deals in breach. Mullen's I know they're the largest, breach firm in the world. They specialize in that. So it's important you have legal counsel that specializes in that. Insurance carriers like to see that. What else do you kind of advise your clients on in terms of the process and how that works as well? Because it certainly can be a labyrinth, can it?
Yeah, and one thing that I kind of didn't mention on the outset is your peers are all struggling with the same thing. So oftentimes for the public entity space, we say, how can we pool this risk together, get critical mass, you have critical purchasing power across a state, across a county, across multiple school districts, and do sessions with teams like this with your peers, right? You learn lessons. Like I'm sure, Greg, you've been in scenarios where when customers have had a shared experience of going through an event, they don't want to spill all the details, but they can talk as someone who's been in your shoes, particularly facing an incident. So we say pooling risk brings, better capital to bear, but also allows you to do more things as a collective group, education, preparation, buying tools that might help you down the line. So I'd be remiss to say that you don't feel like you have to do this alone. I think you can do it as a group with your peers to share experiences, share what works, share some of the unique challenges facing, whether you're in a water reclamation district or you're in a school district. Being with your peers, I think, helps a ton to prepare for these events and then just make yourselves more resilient by sticking together.
We have a couple minutes left. Leslie, I'm going to open the floor to questions. If there's any maybe that I'm not seeing, Leslie, if you could let me know. But certainly want to take on any questions before we give closing comments. As I kind of leave that on the table, I'll move forward and just with each of you, if you just like to give, a closing comment on this space and cyber, I think that would be helpful for the audience, and then I'll close our session out if we don't have any questions. And Greg, I'll just start with you.
Okay, 4 quick points. One, if you have a cyber insurance policy and you have a designated, breach firm, law firm, put that information in your cell phone so it's easily accessible. Just those hotlines. You don't need to have the whole policy in your hand, but a policy number might be helpful in the notes. That way you just know who to call if something does happen, because it doesn't always happen when you're sitting at your desk on a Wednesday afternoon. It happens, late at night or on a weekend or on a holiday. And we're available 24/7, 365. So you reach out to us, we can get you to the carrier, we can get you moving in the right direction. 2, that if you have a ransom demand, don't go at negotiations yourself. There are experts that can help with that. So you may see a link, you may see a way to get to the chat site, but that could start the clock, start timers, make things much more difficult down the road. And then if you know that there's been a wire fraud issue, the sooner you can get to us, the sooner you can get to law enforcement, the better. Within 48 hours, law enforcement tends to throw their hands up and say the money's probably gone. But if we can get their attention, it will hopefully lead to some recovery, if not full recovery of that information. And I had a fourth point, but I'll move on.
Ryan, how about you?
I think just be patient with the insurance product. It's still maybe in its early 20s, trying to figure out its way through life. And so, there's a lot of headlines of things that are not working in the cyber industry, but 98 out of 100 is pretty good for a product that has to respond to an evolving risk. So just bear with us and give feedback on things that are missing and things you want to see, because we have a lot of room to shape it as this industry matures. Michael?
Good point. Michael, closing thoughts.
Back to what Greg said, I think just have that plan in place and know who to call, and don't wait. Oftentimes folks wait to, I want to verify this or I want to verify that, and as soon as you get folks involved, you much rather get folks involved than realize that it's a false positive, or we may not have an issue than get too far along. That time is critical in the beginning. The other thing is just practice relentless preparation. This is not a one and done thing. Cyber and the threat actors, they're going to continue to evolve. It's going to continue to be a hard space, and they're going to continue to make it tough for everybody. So you got to continue doing this. You got to make it a day in and day out process and a practice.
Gentlemen, I just want to thank you again for the time today. Always good spending time to you talking shop and outside of work as well. So everyone have a good Thursday. If there are any additional questions, please feel free to reach out to any of the four of us. We're all on LinkedIn. You can find us there. And thank you guys again for your time today. I really, really enjoyed it.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you.